The Chindits were a British India special force that served in Burma and India in 1943 and 1944 during the Burma campaign of World War II. They were formed to put into effect Orde Wingate's newly developed guerrilla warfare tactic of long-range penetration. The Chindits were trained to operate deep behind Japanese lines. Their operations were marked by prolonged marches through extremely difficult terrain by underfed troops weakened by diseases such as malaria and dysentery. There is controversy over the extremely high casualty rate and the debatable military value of the achievements of the Chindits. Beginnings. The Chindits were the creation of the British Army Brigadier Orde Charles Wingate, then serving under General Archibald Wavell, the Commander-in-Chief of India Command. The name was suggested by Captain Ong Thin of the Burma Army. Chindit is a corrupted form of the Burmese mythical beast Chin-They or Chin-They, statues of which guarded Buddhist temples. In the East African campaign of 1940–41, Wingate had begun to explore the ideas that he later used with the Chindits, when he created and commanded a mixed group of regular Sudanese and Ethiopian units together with Abyssinian partisans, known as Gideon Force. They disrupted Italian supply lines and provided intelligence to British forces. As Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East Command in 1940, Wavell had given permission for Gideon Force for political reasons, because he had thought Wingate's idea to be militarily too unorthodox. After the disbandment of Gideon Force, Wavell requested Wingate for service in Burma in 1942, where it was intended that he raise irregular forces to operate behind the Japanese lines, in a manner similar to Gideon Force. Wingate arrived in Burma in March 1942, barely 2 months before the final Allied collapse and the Japanese conquest of Burma. Rather than organize irregular forces, Wingate spent his time touring the country and developing his theory of long-range penetration on paper. During the final stages of the British retreat from Burma, Wingate had himself specially flown back to India while the rest of the army walked out. Once in Delhi, he presented his proposals to Wavell. Organization and training. The 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, otherwise known as the Chindits, was gradually formed in the area around Jhansi in the summer of 1942. Wingate took charge of the training of the troops in the jungles of central India during the rainy season. Half of the Chindits were British. The 13th Battalion, the King's Liverpool Regiment, and men from the former Bush Warfare School in Burma, who were formed into 142 Commando Company. The other portion of the force consisted of the 3rd Battalion, the 2nd Gurkha Rifles, and the 2nd Battalion, the Burma Rifles. Wingate trained this force as long-range penetration units that were to be supplied by stores parachuted or dropped from transport aircraft, and were to use close air support as a substitute for heavy artillery. They would penetrate the jungle on foot, essentially relying on surprise through mobility to target enemy lines of communication. The standard brigade and battalion structures were abandoned. The force was instead formed into 8 columns, each of which was organized as an infantry rifle company, a air support group with the heavy weapons, a reconnaissance platoon from the Burma Rifles, and a sabotage group from 142 Commando Company. Small detachments from the Royal Air Force, Royal Corps of Signals, and Royal Army Medical Corps were attached to the column headquarters. The heavy weapons, radios, reserve ammunition, and rations and other stores were carried on mules, which would also provide an emergency source of food once the loads had been depleted. With 57 mule handlers, each British column numbered 306 men. Each man carried more than 72 pounds of equipment, which was proportionally more than the mules carrying the support weapons and other stores. This included a personal weapon, such as the SMLE rifle, a Sten gun, ammunition, grenades, a machete, a Gurkha cookery knife, 7 days' rations, ground sheet, change of uniform and other assorted items. Much of this load was carried in an Everest carrier, which was essentially a metal rucksack frame without a pack. Shortly before the first operation, one column was broken up to bring the remaining 7 up to full strength. 2 or more columns were commanded by group headquarters, which in turn was commanded by the brigade headquarters. Operation Longcloth. The original intent had been to use the Chindits as a part of a larger offensive. When this offensive was cancelled, Wingate convinced General Wavell to send the Chindits into Burma anyway. Accordingly, on the 8th of February 1943, Operation Longcloth commenced and 3,000 Chindits, Wingate with them, began the march into Burma. The Chindits crossed the Chindwin River on the 13th of February and faced the first Japanese troops 2 days later. 2 columns marched to the south and received their air supply drops in broad daylight to create an impression that they were the main attack. They even had a man impersonating a British general along with them. The RAF mounted air attacks on Japanese targets to support the deception. These columns were to swing east at the beginning of March and attack the main north-south in areas south of the main force. One column successfully carried out demolitions along the railway, but the other column was ambushed. Half of the ambushed column returned to India. 5 other columns proceeded eastward. 2, those of Michael Calvert and Bernard Ferguson, proceeded towards the main north-south railway in Burma. On the 4th of March, Calvert's column reached the valley and demolished the railway in 70 places. Ferguson arrived 2 days later to do the same. Despite these successes, however, the railway was only temporarily disabled, and resumed operation shortly afterwards. On many occasions, the Chindits could not take the wounded with them. Some were left behind in villages. Wingate had, in fact, issued specific orders to leave behind all wounded, but these orders were not strictly followed, since there were often no established paths in the jungle along the routes. Many times they had to clear their own with machetes and kukris. A single RAF squadron of 6 planes supplied them by air. Once in Burma, Wingate repeatedly changed his plans, sometimes without informing all the column commanders. The majority of 2 of the columns marched back to India after being ambushed by the Japanese in separate actions. After the railway attacks, Wingate decided to cross his force over the Irrawaddy River. However, the area on the other side of the river turned out to be inhospitable to operations. Water was difficult to obtain, and the combination of rivers with a good system of roads in the area allowed the Japanese to force the Chindits into a progressively smaller box. In late March, Wingate made the decision to withdraw the majority of the force, but sent orders to one of the columns to continue eastward. The operations had reached the range limit of air supply, and prospects for new successful operations were low, given the Japanese pressure. The columns were generally left to make their own way back to India. On the journey back, the most difficult actions involved crossing back over the Irrawaddy River. The Japanese had observers and patrols all along the river bank and could quickly concentrate once an attempt at a crossing was detected. Gradually, all the columns broke up into small groups. Wingate's headquarters returned to India on its own ahead of most of the columns. Through the spring and even into the autumn of 1943, individual groups of men from the Chindits made their way back to India. The army did what they could for the men. In one case, an aeroplane was landed in an open area and wounded men were evacuated by air. Part of one column made it to China. Another body of men escaped into the far north of Burma. Others were captured or died. By the end of April, after a 3-month mission, the majority of the surviving Chindits had crossed the Chindwin River, having marched between 750–1,000 miles. Of the 3,000 men that had begun the operation, a third had been killed, taken prisoner or died of disease, and of the 2,182 men who returned, about 600 were too debilitated from the wounds or disease to return to active service. Of the remaining men, Wingate practically hand-picked those few he would retain, while the rest were put back under the normal Army command structure as part of their original battalions. Interlude. Although British Army officers in India criticized the effectiveness of the Chindits, their effect on the morale of the Allied troops in India was refreshing, and they were given plenty of publicity. Wingate wrote an operations report on returning to India, which was controversial for many reasons, including attacks on officers under his command. The report had a tendency to excuse any mistakes made by its author, while making vicious attacks on other officers, often based on limited information. Eventually, through his political allies in London, a copy of the report was given to Winston Churchill, who was impressed and took Wingate with him to the Quebec Conference. His concepts for long-range penetration operations behind Japanese lines received official backing at high level, and he obtained substantial U.S. support for his force. The U.S. Army also began its own plans for the group that later became Merrill's Marauders. As the members of the first expedition were making the way back to India, a second long-range penetration brigade, 111th Indian Infantry Brigade, was being formed, popularly known as the Leopards. The brigade was raised by General Wavell without the knowledge of Wingate, who was still in Burma and who was known to have a strong dislike for the Indian Army, its diverse troop formations, and its British officers in particular. Wavell personally selected the commander of 111th Brigade, Brigadier Joe Linton. Wavell intended to use two Chindit brigades alternately during 1944. While one brigade was operating behind Japanese lines for 2 to 3 months at a time, the other would be resting in India while training for and planning the next operation. However, Wingate returned from Quebec with authority to implement far more ambitious plans for the second expedition, which required that the force be greatly expanded to a strength of 6 brigades. Wingate refused to use Indian Army formations in this force, because he maintained that the training in long-range penetration techniques would take longer and the maintenance by air would be difficult, due to the varied dietary requirements of different Gurkha and Indian castes and religions. Although he had little choice but to accept 111th Brigade and 2 Gurkha battalions in 77th Brigade, since large numbers of trained British infantry were required. 3 brigades were added to the Chindits by breaking up the experienced British 70th Infantry Division, much against the wishes of Lieutenant General William Slim and other commanders, who wished to use the division in a conventional role. A 6th Brigade was added to the force by taking a brigade from the British 81st Division. At Quebec, Wingate had also succeeded in obtaining a private air force for the Chindits, the 1st Air Commando Group, mainly consisting of USAAF aircraft. The Chindits were greatly encouraged by having aircraft on which they could call immediately for supply drops, casualty evacuation and air support. Other welcome American aid was the K ration pack, which, although it provided insufficient calories for prolonged active operations, was far better than the equivalent British ration pack. The forces for the second Chindit operation were called Special Force, officially 3rd Indian Infantry Division, or Long-Range Penetration Groups, but the nickname, the Chindits, had already stuck. The new Chindit force commenced training in guerrilla. Men were trained in crossing rivers, demolitions and bivouacking. Calvert and Ferguson, both newly promoted to brigadier, took command of 2 of the brigades, and were responsible for much of the training program and the development of tactical planning. Wingate himself was absent for much of the training period, first being out of the country to attend the Quebec Conference and then struck ill with typhoid from drinking bad water in North Africa on his return. The plans for the second Chindit operation went through many revisions. The methods of the new long-range penetration force in 1944 differed from those of 1943. Wingate had decided on a strategy of creating fortified bases behind the Japanese lines, which would then send out raiding columns over short distances. This change was in part forced on him by strengthened Japanese patrols along the Burmese frontier, making a repeat of the successful infiltration in 1943 unlikely. In an imaginative move prompted by Colonel Philip Cochrane's assurance that he could transport both troops and supplies by glider, Wingate arranged for the bulk of the force to enter Burma by greatly accelerating the force's ability to reach its target objectives. Advance units would land in gliders in pre-selected open fields in Burma and prepare them for large-scale landings by transport aircraft. The lavish air support provided by Colonels Cochrane and Allison of the 1st Air Commando Group proved critical to the success of the operation. Wingate also had plans for a general uprising of the Kachin population of northern Burma. He fought over these plans with the leadership of Force 136, which was concerned that a premature uprising of the Kachins without a permanent British military presence would lead to the slaughter by the Japanese at the end of operations. Force 136 also had their own plans for a rising to be coordinated with the arrival of the regular army in Burma. Wingate was eventually convinced to scale back his original plans, and further complicating relations between the organizations were orders issued by Wingate to the commander of DA Force not to coordinate operations with Force 136 for security reasons. During the last months of 1943, planning was conducted to carry out the strategy for India as originally determined at the Quebec Conference. In November, the overall plan for the dry season campaign of 1944 determined by Southeast Asia Command focused on the use of the Chindits in the reconquest of northern Burma. These plans were approved by the combined chiefs of staff at the Cairo Conference, and although other offensives in Burma were scaled back or cancelled, Stilwell's Northern Front offensive with the Chindits' participation survived the cuts. The uncertainty of the plans nevertheless meant that the plans and contingency plans for the use of the Chindits repeatedly changed up to the very start of operations. The Chindits were assigned the task of helping the forces of Joseph Stilwell push the Ledder Road through northern Burma to link up with the Burma Road and re-establish an overland supply route to China. By mounting a long-range penetration operation behind the Japanese opposing his forces on the northern front, it had originally been intended that the 4th Corps would attack on the central front and cross the Chindwin to tie up Japanese forces which could otherwise be used to aid the northern front. As the Japanese launched their own attack on the central front, this advance did not meet its objectives, but it still meant that most Japanese forces were engaged on the central front and were not available to reinforce the Japanese 18th Division on the northern front. The Japanese offensive on the central front resulted in further proposals and refinements of the plans for the Chindits. On the 4th of February 1944, Lieutenant General Slim, commander of the British 14th Army, and USAAF General George E. Stratemeyer, commander of Eastern Air Command, issued a joint directive to General Wingate and Coles, Cochrane and Allison of the 1st Air Commando Group, to march and fly into Indore and from there under the command of the 14th Army carry out the objectives of helping the advance of Stilwell's Ledo force on Mayat Ki-ina by cutting the communications of the Japanese 18th Division, harassing its rear, and preventing its reinforcement, creating a favorable situation for the Yunnan Chinese forces to cross the Salween and enter Burma, inflicting the greatest possible damage and confusion on the enemy in North Burma.